Rob, it's your place, your stage.
Okay, thank you. Hey, everyone. So today we're talking about RFCs. This is something that has been established relatively recently within the Polkadot ecosystem. It's a standard way of doing open source development, and it has been for decades, since, let's say, the 70s or 80s, maybe even before that. Wikipedia says the inception occurred in 1969. So this is a tool from open source development that we are drawing on. It's been highly successful. It's a proven format. And this is part of opening up the development process of Polkadot, having an open design, having clear avenues for people to participate in the design and discussion of Polkadot features. Now, what is a request for comments? An RFC is basically it's a document that describes, actually in very painstaking detail, some feature. It describes a protocol, it describes a data format, it describes something which is absolutely integral to development, and then goes through a review process and is basically accepted. Now, different organizations have different ways of accepting RFCs. I'll go through in this presentation what the scope of RFCs are in Polkadot, how RFCs are used, what the process is for accepting them, what they mean, and then we're going to open it up to sort of Q&A, community discussion about this. So we have a relatively short session here. It's only about 25 minutes, and that's what we're going to spend our time on. So RFCs and Polkadot. We've initiated the migration of Polkadot development, in particular the runtimes, to the Fellowship. Fellowship is a developer collective. It's an on-chain registered collective with a voting system that lives on Polkadot. Now, these are developers who, they may be researchers, they may be developing clients, they may be working on the runtime, they may be building other types of infrastructure that are necessary for Polkadot's existence. That's sort of what the Fellowship is, and they coordinate over these RFCs. I'll go through this README here, and in fact, I'll zoom in a bit so people can see it better. I hope everybody in the back can see it. I can try to zoom in even a little bit more. So this is the repository. The repository is Polkadot Fellows /RFCs. There's this new Polkadot Fellows organization on GitHub. This hosts a few repositories, including the Fellowship manifesto itself, as well as these RFCs. Now, what is the scope of RFCs? Well, it's based off of the actual scope of the Fellowship. What does a fellow do? What kinds of things, what kind of activities do Polkadot Fellows engage in? Well, they work on the internals of Polkadot node implementations, data structures, algorithms, even languages or APIs, the consensus algorithms, for example, Babe and Grandpa, or Sassafras, which is coming soon. In fact, there's an RFC open for Sassafras. We have parachain consensus, all of these protocol things like cross-chain message passing, HRMP, DMP, UMP. There's a long list. Everything that goes into both the runtime and nodes. So what logic needs to run in the runtime that all nodes need to agree upon, as well as what logic needs to go in each bit of node software so that those nodes can interoperate and work together to maintain the network. Also includes things such as XCM or standard RPZs, community standards. Now, RFCs in Polkadot are scoped to the subset of these concerns. So it's like everything in that list, the subset of everything in that list, which has to be held consistent across implementations. That means that, for example, a network protocol, the message formats need to be agreed upon. The exact algorithms that are used, we might have RFCs for those in the case that there are very nice algorithms and it's the only algorithm that performs adequately. But in general, we care more about rules than behavior. And so what this is about RFCs, with RFCs, we would scope the rules, right? Like this is the message format, this is the data structure, this is what is supposed to happen when you receive that message on a node. As a non-exhaustive list, we have changes to network protocol descriptions, the runtime logic, say introduction of new pallets or changes of behavior to pallets, public interfaces for runtime, stuff that we would call runtime APIs, essentially ways that the node can gather data from the runtime state. Inherents, transaction formats, those are all things that are in scope for RFCs. And the commitment that the fellowship makes now is to do future development planning via this RFC process. Now, because of the inherent structure of Polkadot's governance, actually doing runtime upgrades is something that OpenGov decides on the root track, right? It's not as though the fellowship could just say, this is going to be the runtime. I think the fellowship has a lot of influence over that, but in theory, OpenGov can just reject any new runtime that the fellowship proposes. It can happen. You know, that's a possible eventuality of governance, is that the fellowship and the rest of governance may at some point disagree on the direction, and in that scenario, OpenGov root track has priority over what the fellowship wants. That means that in practice, RFCs are really only a signaling mechanism. So it's to determine and indicate the fellowship's design and architecture preferences. Now, these are pretty strongly indicated as like, this is what the fellowship wants to do, has sort of agreed upon to do. But at some point down the road, OpenGov can just reject at least runtime code that implements these things. That makes this just a signaling mechanism. That's what this section of the RFC is about. I think it's a subtle point, but the general meaning of it is that RFCs don't on their own determine everything about the direction of the network. It's just what is likely to happen. Now, I think that if there were serious disagreements about like what the fellowship is doing, what everybody else wants, those would be discussed and resolved, et cetera, before it came to like an on-chain split of some kind. That really only applies to runtime code. Now, OpenGov doesn't have authority over, say, what node logic people run on their own computers. So for that, the fellowship definitely has more leeway. For example, when it comes to network protocols, like how do you download blocks from another node? How do you distribute a parachain block to another node so that they can put it into a relay chain block? That stuff is beyond the scope of what OpenGov can manage because it doesn't get records of every little bit of communication that happened on the peer-to-peer network. The fellowship has a lot more leeway with things that are related to node software versus the runtime, the agreed-upon logic of OpenGov. So this is the scope of RFCs, the kinds of things that RFCs are going to be used for, as well as what, in practice, RFCs, fellowship RFCs, will have as an effect on the network. It's a great way to coordinate and signal, this is what the fellowship wants to work on, but those changes are not necessarily guaranteed in the case of disputes with OpenGov. How does this process work? Well, anybody can submit an RFC, absolutely anybody. Don't need to be in the fellowship, don't need to necessarily be a developer. It probably helps if you're in the developer or in the fellowship, but anybody can participate in this process, submit RFCs, comment on them, provide feedback. This is as open a process as possible because this is how open source advances. The intention here is to not give the fellowship complete autonomy over everything that is even discussed or could be considered. That, in fact, we've already seen RFCs originate from outside of the fellowship, and this is absolutely the intention because there are going to be good ideas coming from many different directions. So the process is somebody opens an RFC according to a template, which we'll go over, submits a pull request, there's a back and forth of discussion, comments, revisions, et cetera, and then the fellowship can vote on it. And the fellowship is a collective that's enshrined on the collective's system chain. There's a specific type of remark, so the fellows would host a referendum on that system chain, on the collective's chain, to essentially say, approve this RFC with this number, with this text hash. This was the hash of the RFC text, and we approve it or we disapprove it. And if it's approved, then it's basically a signal that this is something that the fellowship has agreed upon as useful to implement. It's not necessarily binding to how much time it's going to take. There's a separation of concerns here. There's the, this is mostly about the what, not the who, when, or how. Those questions are also very worth answering, but RFCs are primarily about what, not who does it, when does it happen, and how is it going to be rolled out. Those details can appear in RFCs, but they're not the general purpose of RFCs. Fellowship can reject RFCs as well if they need more revisions or it's just generally a bad idea. If there's it's a buggy protocol or it doesn't make sense or something like that. And RFCs might also just not get voted on if they don't really come to the attention of the fellowship. This is maybe a weakness. There's no forcing function that forces the fellowship to vote on RFCs after any particular time. However, important stuff will get voted on, or the fellowship's not doing its job. That's where the community comes in to basically put pressure on the fellowship, say, hey, there are these RFCs, vote on this. That's actually a very important part of the process. There are some specific bits of language that appear in RFCs, like how do you lay out requirements? RFCs should be laid out in a requirements-based form of, this is the problem we're trying to solve, here's what it looks like, and there's very specific language about the terms must not, shall not, should, it's recommended, may, or optional. There's all that. And then this repository also has a bot for generating proposals and basically convenience stuff for going through this whole process described here. Walk through the template as well. So the template looks like this. Has a number. This number should correspond to the GitHub pull request number. This may need to change, for example, if the RFCs need to move off of GitHub. That's one of the reasons that fellows vote on the hash of the text and not, for example, just the number of the text. It needs to be unequivocal based on the history of the chain, what text was actually voted on, even if, for whatever reason, RFCs need to migrate away from GitHub or even Git as a platform. You have a summary, have a motivation, which is expressed in terms of requirements, like why is this desirable, what problems are being solved, who are the stakeholders, who is going to be affected by this RFC, then a detail-heavy explanation of the RFC, any drawbacks, what considerations should be made with respect to testing, security, or privacy? How would this be tested? Does this have security implications? Does this have privacy implications? How does this impact performance or ergonomics or compatibility with previous protocol versions or previous RFCs or backwards compatibility in general? Prior art and references in the sort of academic and research tradition, it's typical to reference anything that was an inspiration for an RFC, anything that might be used as a prior reference that is in the neighborhood of the content of the RFC, and any unresolved questions. This is a section where questions might be posed for discussion. For example, if an RFC draft has a couple alternatives, and there's a trade-off to me, this is something that should be discussed not only by fellows, but also by anybody participating in the process, as well as future directions. For example, if this is a piece of infrastructure, some kind of general improvement, how might this be used? This is a place to sort of brain dump and say, like, yes, this feature is being described very generally. These are some of the things that it might enable in the future. This is for RFCs to sort of seed other RFCs. Some examples of RFCs that have been posted so far. For example, there's RFCs on revisiting the market design of core time sales. RFC number 1 was the agile core time proposal. You have Sassafras consensus, which was opened a couple of, I do not have internet. We'll go over that later. So, for example, you can see that these are spanning a wide variety of different topics. RFCs might not scope everything out. It's possible to revisit RFCs that have already been accepted. RFCs might leave some things out of scope. For example, RFC 1 left the specific pricing mechanism out of scope for the RFC, this creates a gap for people who are very economically minded to come in and say, this should be a system, this is how that part of the system should work. The intention is for every single major update to Polkadot's technology to go through this process. Nothing is really concrete until it goes through this process. And this is a nice way of, in open source, pipelining research, ideation, and then providing a clear signal for development to happen. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. This is a rundown of the RFC process. Do we have questions, discussions? Let's kick it off from here.
So hands up, please, if there is a question. Then I can come to you and give you a microphone. Shortly the name, and then a question.
Hi, Florian. I was wondering how you envision how the process interacts with the actual status quo or what is currently running, and other documents like the spec or even the wiki documentation, these kind of things, because I think they could benefit with some verification or at least review through an RFC-like process.
In some sense, the spec is another client implementation or a runtime reference implementation. It should be the case that RFCs are reflected both in client implementations and in specification. Now, one thing that is out of scope for RFCs is describing everything that has been implemented so far. Just as a matter of pure practicality, there is a lot of stuff that has been implemented. Much of it is fairly ad hoc. It hasn't been through these types of processes. However, with this direction, with roadmap items and clear descriptions of what is going to be implemented in the future, I would like to see it should provide a mechanism for the spec to exactly mirror the behavior of clients as they are coordinated through this text-based process as opposed to just being coordinated through pull requests and code that were made to a repository.
Another hands. Irina.
Hi, Irina here. Just going back to the fellowship, I'm wondering how can one join a fellowship? Does it have to be an individual application? Do you have to be an engineer or like business people and marketing people, or just can anybody join or create a collective? Because I know that Polkadot ambassadors are becoming a collective and that's becoming a general trend. So could you please give us a bit more detail on that? Thank you.
Yeah. So for the Polkadot Fellowship specifically, one must be a developer, an engineer working on something within this scope. Collectives themselves have to be chosen by relay chain governance. There are other collectives that are being discussed, for example, the Ambassador Program, the Polkadot Alliance, an Ecosystem Developer Fellowship. These collectives would have different scopes. However, these RFCs are focused specifically on technology and engineering. Now, that said, anybody can propose an RFC or comment on it. The fellowship is just a decision-making apparatus on which things should be added to the core protocol and what should they look like.
Another hand.
Yeah, hey Rob, Mauricio here. So concerning RFC, how does the voting process be? So do the members in the fellowship who have higher ranks have more weights on their votes? Or is it unified to all members in the fellowship, and also like the streamline to make something from ideation to implementation? What are the necessary steps, and who are in the ranks who are more responsible to make this certain idea from ideation to implementation?
Yeah. So the fellowship assigns different voting weights according to the rank in the fellowship. And the ranks are set out over here. Essentially, the voting power of any individual member is proportional to the index of the rank. So for example, a candidate is someone who wants to join the fellowship but isn't really quite in it yet. Then you have members, proficients, fellows. These are sort of like true professionals, high value contributors, really senior ones, experts. Once you get beyond rank 4, the concerns move from, to a large extent, from software development to software architecture. So it's more likely that fellows of rank 4 and above will be the ones pushing forward RFCs, because those are the ranks that concern themselves with architecture. But in fact, even to proceed to those ranks, one must demonstrate an ability to architect software systems. What that means is that someone who's in these lower ranks who wants to advance into the architecture stage, how do you actually participate in architecture? Well, it's through RFCs. So they would want to demonstrate that they can produce RFCs that are then accepted and generally accepted to be valuable. But yes, the voting process is a referendum where members of the fellowship may vote with power according to their rank.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Name and then the question.
Hi, Antonio here. The question I have is, what's the relationship between the traditional RFC process, which most of the cases tend to focus on, let's say, down into details, how things work, and what's the role of Parity in the long-term vision of Polkadot? Like, how does the RFC process somehow balance the longer-term vision, which is something that probably is not kind of responsibility of the RFC process itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now the status quo is that many fellowship members are part of Parity. The fellowship and all of this RFC infrastructure is a step to create open systems that allow fellowship, to allow essentially vision and architecture to be done more effectively outside of Parity as well. This to me implies that vision, in fact, will be handled more so by the fellowship. At least technical vision will be handled more so by the fellowship than Parity. And I think it would be reasonable to apply the same standard to other collectives which are established. For example, ecosystem developer fellowships, deciding on tooling and so on. What we don't want, I'd say, as an ecosystem is for architecture and vision to result as the output of a closed process which is not transparent. And this type of open design is a step towards making that vision clear. Now, many RFCs are going to be very in the weeds. They're going to be things like, oh, we should use this Merkle tree format instead of that one, or this is the exact tweak that we want to make to the network messages. I think architecture RFCs can also be very high level in terms of, here's a general description of, well, architecture is usually based on things like interfaces. For example, HTTP is described in RFCs. And you have an interface, which is to some extent it's in the weeds. It's something like get and post and all the headers and things that you would apply in an HTTP message. But there's an implicit vision in that description, that low-level technical description of an interface that is carried with it. And that's sort of the role that I see of many architecture RFCs. And the ones that have the most influence on the vision are going to be RFCs which largely specify interfaces between things, because that carries a lot of implications of how different components of the system are meant to interact. So interfaces tend to bake in visions, and that is the responsibility of the fellowship. We have 1 minute left, so one question.
One question left.
Sergey, from the foundation. Do you expect that Web3 Foundation will submit these RFCs? For example, one of the first listed on some of your screens was a sassafras probably submitted by Parity. Is it the right way to do so? The implementer should submit it, or like we should do it?
Yes. The RFCs must be described in sufficient detail to implement. That means that, for example, in the case of sassafras, it must not just be a general description of something that looks like sassafras, but actually all of the details that come with the sassafras protocol that would be in sufficient detail to actually implement in a piece of node software, directly going from the RFC to writing code. Now, who submits that, I would say, is unimportant. For example, we actually have seen quite a number of RFCs from Jonas from the Web3 Foundation focusing on economics. It should not matter who submits the RFC. In this case, it was submitted by the developer who's working on implementation of Sassafras as a precursor to including that in the node, software Polkadot. But I see no reason it could not come from Web3 Foundation as well, provided that it's in that sufficient level of detail to be directly applied to code.
Good. Yeah. Then now, hello.
Test. Test. Yeah.
Okay.
Then
Great.
you put your
Let's
laptop and then the next
wrap
one.
it up.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
you
And
very
I'll be
much.
standing outside there to discuss RFCs more.